Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, I assure you. But here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming, especially during these past 2 years. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, and Talking Toddlers, this podcast helps you develop that with clarity, confidence, and clear communication. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin Heyer, your host, and this week we're going to talk about what's the difference between speech and language, and does it really make a difference? So, as a speech language pathologist with many, many years behind me, it's still surprising to me to understand that many professionals within my domain of study, such as pediatricians and psychologists and even school-based educators, don't really understand the true difference. And so I want to explain to parents the difference, because it's really important when you watch and support and navigate this modern world, but you watch and support your child growing and building his or her skills, that you understand the differences, because there are so many intricate and subtle nuances happening simultaneously in these remarkable 3 to 5 to 8 years and beyond, but these critical first chapter in his or her life. And so it's important to really understand what we're doing, what we're creating. And I've talked a lot thus far about brain development and how the brain learns to learn, and how there are naturalness in our humanness, right? We're hardwired to do certain things, such as speech and human communication, but it has to be fertilized. It has to be well loved and supported and guided through this process. So in a nutshell, speech is the physical part of talking, and language is everything else. That's kind of it in a black and white, concrete position. But it's all interconnected. And if you go back and listen to previous episodes, you'll hear me talk about all the foundation that is critical to the first words, right? And that the auditory, that's the hearing canals on the right and the left ears that are feeding data into this brain and helping wire it up. So this week, I'm going to kind of give you a 30,000 foot view of these pretty intricate processes, at the same time give you a heads up of how I will be doing deep dives into very specific areas, such as, feeding and eating, and how that relates to speech and language development as well. But today, really kind of just comparing the two of speech and language processing that builds human communication. And keep in mind, what my purpose of this podcast is really focusing on some of those foundational skills, such as, babies and toddlers and young kids, humans altogether, actually. Our first instinct is just survival, right? And so all of this extra learning, extra development, it takes effort. So we, as the parents and the adults guiding these children, need to really understand that speech and language are the foundation to lifelong learners, but it takes time to to really enhance and build upon through everyday experiences. Of course, it's not like you have to, have the latest gadgets. And if you've listened to any of my podcasts thus far, you know that I'm not a big fan of screens with these early years, but we shape and build this from the ground up, keep it simple, and that parents really are key and pivotal in this, especially in this modern world where we tend to really kind of give the reins over to the schools or to outside communities, thinking that you really do need this big, large community or village, so to speak. But I really think, especially these first 3, 4, 5 years, home is best for the vast majority. Yes, socialization, such as playground and maybe some school. We can kind of talk about that. But because our modern world is changing, we have to say, what can mom or dad or whatever your family dynamics look like? What do the homes look like to support this early speech and language development? And I know things have shifted so much in the last couple of years, and becoming a new parent, I can't even fathom, actually. Like if I had a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old and trying to navigate how the world turned upside down in the last 24 months, I think I would be pulling my hair out. So I'm here to support you. We can do it together. Maybe you're looking at trying homeschooling for a little while, just extending that early, rich home-based learning as long as you can. Maybe you can't even begin to imagine it, but you're open to what else can I do at home to help augment and supplement what's happening in a structured preschool setting. And maybe you'll change your mind down the road. Who knows? I'm here to give you this information to help no matter what your path is, and to be fluid, right? To know that this whole ebb and flow of life is fluid. So we have to remain flexible. So let's go back to the first foundational step is really building relationships and those early connections when your baby first is placed in your arms. And that we refer to them as citizens of the world because babies are born every day, thousands of them every single day. Unknowing, well, that's not entirely true because they are very, very familiar. And I talked about this in an episode or two ago about they're very familiar with the biological mom's voice, right? So we're wired to connect in that human voice because that's my lifeline. My first preference is my biological mom, but if I can't get that, then I'll get the next best woman or I'll get a man. I know the human voice will keep me alive at least for the next 3 or 4 months before I have the skills to really interface with this world. But we call them citizens of the world because they are wired ready to decode and learn any language, whether it's French or Chinese or English or African clicks, they're ready to do it. And so we've known this for many, many decades, and science has proven it with some really excellent studies. I remember, in the 80s and 90s, there in LA with some good studies looking at the differences between Chinese babies and American babies, and that at birth and up through their 8th month, give or take a week here and there, that the Chinese babies and the American babies both were able to auditorily hear the difference, perceive the difference with the sounds R, like in rat, and L, like in love. They were able to auditorily discriminate them and perceive the differences. Somewhere around the 8th month, the Chinese babies no longer responded because those two sounds are not in their native language. They pruned it away because they recognized those particular sounds are not relevant. They're not needed in order for me to acquire and develop my native tongue. And so, and this has been done with a number of languages across the world. We now know that somewhere around the 8th month that the auditory cortex is mature enough and has had enough rich language stimulation by the family that they're really pruning language elements away. The truth is, babies are born with about 50 billion neurons, and by the time they're 18, they've pruned it down to 10 billion. So there's a lot of neurological work going on, and shaping and reshaping and utilizing what they need in order to acquire the skills to not only survive, but to really thrive in this environment and interact with the other humans. So this auditory processing is really looking at patterns, and that's laying that foundation. And I think in the next episode, at the time of recording this, I have kind of planned out like a series of episodes that will link to one another. And so today I'm kind of talking about the basic differences between speech and language processing. And then I will, in a different episode, talk about speech and chewing and how those are correlated with one another, and what the physical elements are needed to produce certain speech sounds at a certain developmental period, and they coincide with chewing and eating and developing those skills. So, but in those first 3 months, it's really about auditory processing, because they're primarily their motor skills, their speech skills are just cooing, right? Just kind of feeling their voice and making phonations, making gurgly sounds and all of that. But they're really not trying to speak on purpose yet. It's us, it's the adults in their life that are stimulating. They make a funny sound, like a gurgling sound, and we imitate them. And then because we're building a loving relationship with them and building that intimacy, then they begin over time to imitate us back. But we really instigate it in the beginning. So in these early weeks and months, birth to about 3, it's really about, the auditory processing of figuring out what's important, what's not important, like pruning away sounds that aren't being reinforced in your native language, and playing around with your mouth, right? Cooing and crying and gurgling and giggling, as they interface and play with us and learn how to play with us, right? And so that's when the physical part of talking begins. And it's really about over the first 12 months and then the first 36 months, really getting the 26 muscles from our diaphragm up to coordinate and produce a very, very complicated speech patterns of language, of your native language. Again, whatever your native language is. But that's when someone is looking at speech sound development, it's the physical part of putting all of those elements together. And we do have specific developmental expectations, and there's an order, there's a process. And for example, somewhere around the 4th, 5th month, they really are producing with their lips coming together sounds like the M for ma, 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 or B and P. ba, 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 pa, 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 pa. Again, I've shared this before in the past, but not to put not to pop your bubble as parents, but when the babies, young babies, especially at 6 months, 6 months, start to say ma, 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 or pa, 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 they're not really calling us by our name that we've identified. It's really just the developmental hierarchy of how it's really the lip closure and then putting phonation, their voice with it. And we, over the centuries, have taken on that identification that mama, mama comes from mother, or papa, 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 is a nickname for father. But it's really motor development. And so you start with these, what we call bilabials. The two lips are coming together, like I just said. And then you have the back sounds, the k, 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 the K sound, and the G. And those both are made motorically exactly the same way. One's voiced and one's voiceless, right? The babies then begin to learn how to turn their voice on and off. At the same time, they're also mastering all of the vowels, and those are all the vowels are voiced, right? Our voice is turned on. And then they move into finer discrimination with the T sound, like in tip, 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 or D, like in do, do, do. And that's the tip of the tongue coming up and hitting kind of the front part of where your front teeth come in. At the same time, with all the vowels, they're learning their jaw, how it comes up, how it can move up and down. We call that gradation or grading, right? To learn how there are actually kind of 6 heights of the jaw height level, from a high level like E to an open ah. And so those are there are 6 steps in there, and babies play around with that. So as they move from cooing and we engage them and they start to go do this turn taking, then they start to play with some of those consonant sounds. Sometimes it happens by accident. We reinforce it and they keep going with it. But they do need, in the first 3, 6, 9, 12 months, they need the visual to watch us, and they need the auditory to hear us, to map those two things together. At the same time, remember I said speech is the physical part of talking, and then language is everything else. And that language is very, very weighted, right? So you have the receptive language, how well they understand and process the information, the words and the sentences and the phrases. And then you have the expressive, how well they can express at the words, the phrases and the sentences. But then you also have to put together the nonverbal elements, the intonation, the pattern. What do you mean? When I raise my voice at the end of a sentence, what? That's asking a question. That's different. If I get really, really quiet, does that mean that, it's a secret, or it's something special, or it's a little more closer to home than if I'm talking really loudly and laughing up a storm? And all these different patterns and intonation and pitches and rhythm, they're coding all of that and mapping it to the speech sounds and the speech patterns. And the patterns are, how I string certain sounds together to make certain words. That cat, that k, at, goes in a certain order. But if I change the order and said t, ak, tack, is different than cat, even though they have the same 3 sounds. So there's a lot of mental gymnastics going on and firing and wiring. And at the same time, they have to physically practice, right? And that's the cooing and the babbling. And then they kick in the jargon, right? They're just practicing, even though they're not saying anything that we understand, but they certainly are physically practicing it. And that's why, and I'm just going to say a side note here, that's why I've been so incredibly concerned over the last 2 years with the whole masks and the separation and the issues around that. Again, I'm not, my purpose on here is not necessarily to talk about the political issues or the medical ramifications. I'm just talking about the basic human development that babies deserve and that they need in order to build a healthy, vibrant, language-based learning brain, right? And so, my heart was always incredibly torn when we had to work with little ones with masks, or I just see them in the grocery store. It breaks my heart, with all honesty. And I know, many, many people out there agree with me, and it's not political. It's just simply developmental. And many people, have different opinions, and I get that. But here on my purpose of this podcast and these episodes are to help parents understand what natural, healthy human development is, how we can help support it every day, how to mitigate and keep kids on track if things go awry, and that you always have choices, and that, and that you have to compensate sometimes, right? Sometimes babies are sick and they go in the hospital and they don't have the opportunity, to be held and loved and nurtured. You have to deal with those kinds of things. I get that. I'm just here to speak the truth about what is healthy and natural and how can we always keep moving forward. So now in that regard with speech, right, the physical part of talking and working all of our articulators, our jaw, our lip, and our tongue. And the tongue is a very interesting muscle because it is the only muscle in our body that's attached on one end, right? It has a point of origin, but there's no point of insertion, right? It's moving. It has to stabilize itself within your oral structures, your teeth, your palate, right, the roof of your mouth, the base, the floor, and it stabilizes itself within itself, right? There are four pairs of muscles that make up the tongue, but and it has to make these tiny, tiny little movement patterns. So when we're talking about speech and language, sometimes kids have delays in both. Sometimes it's just a speech and articulation. The tongue is not coordinated enough. Sometimes kids are what we call speech delayed, so they are developing on the right path. They're just hitting the mark a little bit slower than their peers. And then there are, definitely deficiencies or disorders, right? Speech and articulation disorders where, by 2, there are certain speech patterns that should be kicked in. Like, for example, all of the vowels should be able to be produced. And so, in this last year, I've been seeing a lot of younger and younger kids for lots of different reasons. But, and quite often, one of the first things is that they're not doing a lot of vocal play, and they don't even have a lot of different vowel sounds that they can produce, right? So when I look at speech and language development, they work in unison, and there's a lot of different moving parts, literally and figuratively. So here on this podcast, my primary goal is prevention, to get information out there to the parents when your babies are little, when they're 1 or 2 or 3. If you have questions about delays, or is my child really, presenting with a severe disability? What does that mean? What does it look like? What can I do? It's really about early identification, and always know that you parents can get on it too, right? it's always been a challenge, to get an evaluation, whether it's, through your state and early intervention or through, if your child hit the third year and they have to go into the public schools and get an evaluated that way. You can get a private if there are in your area. Here in Vermont, it's a little tricky. There aren't a lot of private people like me, but I think it's important that parents, and one of the reasons that I'm really doing this podcast is really to let parents know that you shouldn't wait ever. The more information, the more power or knowledge that you can hold on to and recognize what's typical or what's natural, what's expected and common with a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and how do you support them and understand how everything you choose to do will help them, from the nutrition. And like I said, I think either next week or in a couple of weeks, I'll have an episode talking about, chewing and speech development and how they coincide with one another. But nutrition and how that feeds the brain, looking at movement and play, looking at social connection and family time, and building social communication skills and emotional regularity. These are all things that I think parents are constantly having to evaluate and kind of, like I said in the very beginning, ebb and flow, be willing and open to change. Looking at free play and engaged play, looking at how much time do I get outside in the fresh sunshine. Again, I'm in the Northeast. It was a very, very long winter. Looking at stress and looking at your self-regulation and your levels of stress, and how does that reflect on your kids? Looking at how am I building routines in my day? A 1, 2, 3-year-old thrive with routines, not rigidity, kind of, okay, it's 10 o'clock, we have to do this. And that's one of my concerns. The more I look into preschool settings, they're so rigid, and there's not a lot of ebb and flow. There's not a fluidity in it. And sometimes kids are just getting into whatever they're doing, building a mud pie or getting into pretend play in the kitchen, and they have to switch tasks, and so there's not a lot of spontaneity left. So lifestyle choices, what parents constantly, you have to, be reflecting on, what am I doing? Are there too many toys? Can I downsize? Can I rotate the toys in and out? And I talk a lot about this with the families that I work with, and pick and choose and organize their toys and understand how it's not haphazard. It's not crazy. That there's a time and place for that, whether it's outside or just being silly one day and, making messes in the kitchen, that's fine. But I think, kids really are hungry for routines, and it helps them understand what's coming next in my day. Oh, I know that after we have, breakfast, we're going to go for a walk, or we're going to, walk the dog, or we're going to, go wash our hands and sing funny songs in the mirror, that they're building these natural routines, and they can anticipate it. And so they're not just being picked up and moved and picked up and moved and picked up and moved, that they're beginning to understand how their day unfolds. A lot of things that the humans can do is that we let the pendulum swing really, really far away one way or the other. And I just nowadays, and I think, this whole pandemic and how our world turned upside down shined a light onto how our preschools are designed, and not necessarily that the pendulum has swung to hyper organized, and that and it's not really the teacher's faults or even the administrator's fault. Slowly but surely over time, we have developed this idea that they need a curriculum, that, a 3, 4, 5-year-old has to learn these pre-academic things. And that's not necessarily true. It really, really isn't. That you can embed some of those things, like, understanding how to use tools like maybe scissors and a pencil or a marker or chalk and those kinds of things, but it can be done naturally. And, that letters and names, or letters and color names, are important too. But again, it could be done naturally. And I just think that it's become a little too contrived, and kids are tuning out. I mean, I've sit in a lot of preschools, and some of the best of the best. And again, I don't think they're doing it on purpose. I just think the system itself has gotten too stuck in filling up each and every 5-minute block, and that the kids are quite often tuning out, and that the richness of language and play and spontaneity and creativity is kind of lost. So when I look at these two sides of the same coin, speech, the physical part of talking, and language processing, receptive, taking in language, encoding your language, and being able to understand what the adults are asking or talking about. So the developmental kind of hierarchy or process for speech is, those first, birth to 3 months, there's a lot of cooing. There's a lot of, figuring out, this voice is coming out of this body, and how does that work? And that's why they're always looking at you. They're always trying to figure out, and there's a lot of reflexes going on to help them survive, because that's the only time that the human being is really, really helpless those first couple of months. And then there's babbling, right? The babbling really kind of kicks in around the third or fourth month, and they're starting to really play with sounds on purpose, mostly for themselves, and then they get in these interactions with us. So the speech is wiring the physical movements and patterns at the same time that the language is building from the bottom up. For my previous episodes, really talking about receptive, and nonverbal engagement, right? With gestures and, play, give and take kind of things. And this is where I like to caution parents, like when I see a new family, the child might be 18 months or 24 months, and I really have to kind of help them step back and look that toddlers aren't really being naughty per se at that age. They really don't understand how to do that, even though you can tell that, they're being playful, or they could be even a little flirty, and they're trying to, kind of poke you a little bit. But they don't look at it consciously as, being naughty. Because we use terms that they simply have no bloody idea what they mean. Like, oh, don't touch that. It will hurt you. It's hot. It will burn. They don't understand those concepts because they've never been burnt, and they've never really been all that hurt, right? A little bump here and there. They've been pretty well protected. They don't understand the word dangerous. Oh, that's dangerous, honey. Don't touch that, or don't stick that stick in the light socket. Their little brains are just fascinated with everything. They want to see how things work. That's why they open and close cupboard doors. They just want to see how it works. Oh, here's a little tiny knob. It's the size of my fingers. I can grab it and hold it and shut it and open and shut and open and shut and open. That they're just fascinated. They want to stick small things in little holes. And here's a quick little story. I'll never forget this. I was in private practice, maybe, 5, 6 years, and this great family, and it was in LA, but the dad was like 6'4", and mom was tall too, like 5'10", and this little guy, his name is Alan. There's a lot of Alans, so you don't know who he is, but confidentiality and all. But this little kid, he, just had a kind of a mild to moderate, speech, articulation, the physical part of talking, delay. But he wasn't much of a chatty Cathy at all, but he liked small things. He liked little, he would collect little buttons, and he was very careful. He didn't put them in his mouth or anything, but he would, collect little things, little rocks, little pebbles, and one day his dad tells me that he had a hellacious time at work because he got there and he was stuck in his vehicle with the seatbelt. The seatbelt would not release. And this was a long time ago. So it was before cell phones, and he really had to squirm out of this. Here's a 6'4" guy squirming, sweating in hot LA to get out of this. And I think he said he had a pair of nail clippers that he would just it took him forever to clip away part of the seat belt so he could squirm out of that. Lo and behold, this little beautiful child put in a few pennies and a couple of dimes in the little seatbelt latch, right in the opening where you latch the seatbelt. And as soon as the dad jumped in the car and buckled himself up thinking he was just going to have a great day at work, lo and behold, he had finally got AAA out of there, and and it was a nightmare. But little Alan loved to put little pebbles and coins and things in places they didn't belong, out of curiosity, out of fascination. I'm sure he dropped a penny, it disappeared. Drop another one, it disappeared. But because out of curiosity, and we want to encourage that, right? We want them to want to explore the world in a safe manner and, not lock your dad in the seatbelt. But the whole idea is when they are at that age, because their language is just beginning to explode, that when they do something that bothers you, try your best to be flat and not reactive. Because as soon as they understand your emotion, again, they're not consciously trying to be naughty or mean or any of that. They just say, wow, I like that emotion. Mom really reacted. She got all hot under the collar. Let's see if I can do it again. Because they don't understand the cause and effect kind of idea. They don't understand emotion yet. They have, happy and crying. That's about it. But if you can remain kind of detached, oh no, honey, you can't touch the knife. That hurts. Of course, you're teaching them the language. No, that is sharp, and that's not for kids. They don't understand negation at that time either. So you'll have to say, no, mommy has the knife. Mommy takes the knife. And at 2, I think it's a lot easier. I understand how people have said for decades, the terrible 2s, but I always think the 3s are worse because they have richer language. They have more memory. They can really hold you to something, and they are tenacious in their negotiations. But a 2-year-old, you can take the knife and give him a napkin and, put it over his head and start playing peekaboo, and he's completely forgotten all about the sharp tool, right? And you can help them, hand over hand, put things away at 2 and hopefully at 3. But again, they're a little bit more tenacious. They have a little bit more worldly knowledge at 3, and they can then start to be kind of naughty or nasty or, really dig their heels in and fight back, resist, right? A 2-year-old, you can still kind of distract them sweetly without too much, and get them excited. And a 3-year-old, of course, you can do this too. But but because their language, the growth between a 24-month and a 36-month is huge, right? They go from 50 words, which is kind of low average, to 3,000 words, which is high average. Anywhere in between, that's a lot of knowledge. So and the language, that's where the language part comes in, right? Understanding emotions, understanding vocabulary, being able to express yourself. But Mama, I really want to, use that knife and dig in the table. No, you can't. That's not acceptable. But the language processing is so much more weighted. I often say, because you go from single words, no, don't touch, to after you finish your lunch, then we'll go to the park and we'll meet your best friend, Freddie, and we'll have fun on the slide. A whole long story, and they'll understand all of it. So it's really that. And then he'll say, oh, no, I don't want to go see Freddie. I want to go swimming with Freddie, or whatever. The whole language, give and take and flow, more complex. And it really is two sides of the same coin, because if we start digging really deep into speech and the articulation of those 26 muscles that we have to coordinate in order to, to produce English, then that's pretty complex too, especially if you have a child, say, who has low sensory tone to the tongue and he can't elevate it and he can't say half the sounds you want him to say. That's a pretty complex problem too. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't understand you. It means that, that is a physical weakness, low muscle tone, sort of like having a low, a low muscle back, right? You're injured your back or something. This child isn't injured per se, but developmentally, he hasn't acquired the muscle strength. And there's lots of different reasons why. And in this episode, we're not necessarily talking about the causes, other than the fact that as a child continues to grow and learn and develop, you as the parent are more and more aware of, if my 2-year-old is not speaking like, his cousin who's the same age, then you kind of step back and you try to look at what's going on, right? Is it speech, and just that he's not putting the muscle actions together? Is it that he doesn't really pay attention to me and he's kind of disengaged? Is it, it could be a young child who's had recurrent ear infections and they have a slower processing system. So they do kind of get the language that you're using with them. It just takes them more time. So there's a lot of different possibilities. So my purpose here today is to give you guys this 30,000 foot view of what is speech, what are the physical elements necessary to human communication, and then all of the other language elements too. Kids can fall anywhere on this continuum. And, we will talk about, like I referenced a little while ago, about lifestyle, choices that can help support healthy growth and development, and some choices that can dampen it and inhibit it. And, I'm not saying that parents are the reason that kids might have a speech and language delay, but if there is a challenge, a glitch in the system, we always have to step back and say, okay, of course we're going to try to figure out why, but we're also going to say, what are all the different all the different variables that could be contributing to this, to making it worse or better or just more challenging, right? And that goes back to looking at nutrition, looking at how much movement and play, looking at his sleep, looking at, How much free time does he have? How much time am I really, really engaged with him? And, part of my mission is helping parents learn how to be really, really comfortable in their parenting, really to get on the floor and just to be present, to be playful and engaged. And that's, especially these first 3 or 4 years, that's what your kids need. That's how they, build the connection with you, but also learn from you how to speak, how to relate, how to engage, how to laugh, and giving them the opportunity to practice that physical muscle of not only talking and making speech sounds, but then putting these sounds into words and words into sentences and sentences into conversation, right? It's built up. And I know that nowadays there's also talk about the Gestalt language processing and the analytical language processing. And that's another episode, of course. But if we're talking about what is the best healthy kind of rhythm, this ebb and flow of growing and learning, it's really that kids do both, right? And that they, through their experiences at home with you, they're building these neural networks, these pathways, right? I always describe it as like LA freeway, right? And where all these, the 90 and the 605 and the 210, they just all kind of intertwine and overlap. And, you're driving 75 miles an hour and it's a 6-lane freeway. And you're navigating. It's fast. It's quick. And it's a process, though. They have to really experience it with you to gain that automaticity, that mastery, the fluency that we talk about. And so my purpose is, again, to help kind of clear some of this clutter, that speech is the physical part of talking, and there are different types of speech challenges. And it is related to eating and chewing and that development. They kind of develop in unison, and there's like this give and take. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's by chance. I think it's purposeful. But not all kids who have speech issues also have chewing issues and vice versa. So we have to always just be gathering information, right? Being a detective. And then language processing. That is something that is just remarkable. And we'll dive deep into that. But today, it's really about what are the main differences, looking at how is my everyday contributing to healthy growth and development, and how can I help them through better understanding of my role, right? Take back the reins and help them develop over time with purpose and intention as a parent, right? Conscientious parenting, right? To be present and mindful, and to, as a parent of a young child, to have this open mindset that there are no perfect answers or perfect solutions. And yes, children do differ in style and temperament and likes and dislikes, but we have these developmental expectations, these milestones. And that's another episode that's coming that I recorded this week. What do those developmental milestones mean? And are they really important? But and in a nutshell, yes. But are they, an exact science? No. But we have known for 60, 80 years. And we've studied thousands and thousands and thousands of children developing. We understand what a 1-year-old in an average range should be able to do, what a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and how all of these developmental skills, movement, speech, language, emotional regulation, attention, engagement, self-regulation, all of these things, how do they sync up? into this whole child, this whole being. So speech is the physical part of talking, and we can talk later about what the developmental hierarchy is and what some glitches could look like. And then language is really kind of the whole beautiful package, right? It's taking a black and white picture and putting beautiful colors on it. But it's the process of understanding and expressing yourself in this cyclical relationship, right? And it's, even though we test in these compartments, right? There's speech over here, there's receptive language over here, there's expressive language over here. But in real life, it's all just this beautiful network. And the timing is impeccable. We're talking about milliseconds, 25 milliseconds at firing speech sounds. And that our brain is, close to 20 characters ahead of us as our tongue is trying to coordinate and produce speech in connection and be understood by our listener. So it's really, really intricate. And yet at the same time, if we give the opportunities, then our children will blossom. And that's our goal, right? Happy, healthy, thriving kids that are curious and want to learn. That's it. So thank you for listening. Again, Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin Heyer. Go ahead and share this with a friend, a family member, a teacher, a college student, someone who is thinking about being a parent, someone who is a new parent. And also go down and if you like what I said, write a review, help me out, reach more parents like you, more interested adults who want to kind of take back the reins and step into this beautiful role that we've committed to as being parents. So I, again, appreciate your time, your precious, precious time, and have a beautiful day. And I can't wait until next week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.